The funeral industry just got caught. Not by a journalist, not by a whistleblower, by the United States Federal Trade Commission, which sent undercover investigators to more than 250 funeral homes across this country, placed calls asking basic questions about pricing and legal requirements, and found violations of federal consumer protection law in 39 of those calls. 39 out of 250. 1 in every 6 funeral homes investigated was either refusing to answer basic pricing questions, giving families false information about what the law requires, or doing both simultaneously. And the specific lie they were telling is one that has cost American families hundreds of millions of dollars over the past 3 decades. They were telling grieving families that embalming was required by law. It is not. Embalming is not required by federal law. It is not required by the law of most states. The very narrow circumstances under which it can ever be required, certain types of interstate transport of remains, are nothing like the situations these families were describing. Funeral homes were charging $700 and more for a service families had zero legal obligation to purchase, and they were using the authority of invented law to prevent grieving families from asking questions or pushing back. That practice is now permanently banned, and it is just the beginning of what is changing in 2026 in ways that every family in America needs to understand, ideally before they ever walk into a funeral home rather than after. I am going to walk you through all of it. What the Federal Trade Commission just permanently banned, what it is now illegal for any funeral home in this country to do to your family, the cost differences between your options that the industry has worked very hard to make sure you never see side by side, and the specific legal rights you have right now, today, that most people do not know exist. Stay through this entire video because the last section, the part about prepaid funeral arrangements and Medicaid, and a specific financial protection that very few people know about, is something that could directly affect your family's financial situation. Let me show you what just changed. For 30 years, the funeral industry operated under rules that had a specific and very useful gap in them. Funeral homes were required to give you a written price list if you walked in and asked for it. They were required to answer pricing questions on the phone if you called. But they were not required to put their prices on their website. Not required to make pricing available online in any format whatsoever. That single gap, the online pricing gap, is the structural mechanism through which most of the consumer harm in this industry operated for the past 2 decades. Because you could not compare prices from home. You could not sit at your kitchen table on a calm afternoon and look at what 3 different providers charge for the same service. You had to walk into a funeral home while grieving, while exhausted, while managing phone calls and travel arrangements and the administrative reality of a loss before you could find out what anything cost. And that, precisely and intentionally, is the environment in which overcharging happens most effectively. The Federal Trade Commission's updated 2026 rule permanently bans funeral homes from operating without publicly available online pricing. Full itemized general price lists are now required on every funeral home's website. Not recommended, required. With civil penalties of over $50,000 per violation per day for non-compliance. Here is what makes this significant right now. More than 60% of funeral homes in the United States did not have their prices on their website at the beginning of 2026. Every single one of those providers is now required to come into compliance. For the first time in American history, you can sit at home before any loss has occurred and compare what 3 different funeral homes in your area charge for the exact same services, side by side, on a calm afternoon with no one pressuring you and no emotional fog distorting your judgment. Here is what you need to do with this right now. Open your browser and search for funeral homes in your area. Click on their websites and look for pricing. If a funeral home's website does not have a published general price list in 2026, that provider is not in compliance with federal law. That is important information to have before you decide whether to trust them with anything else. Let me tell you about the second practice that is now permanently banned, because it is one that cost families thousands of dollars per transaction and was standard operating procedure at a troubling number of providers. A family calls a funeral home. They have a specific need. Maybe they want direct cremation. Maybe they want a graveside service without a chapel service. Maybe they want the one thing their family member actually asked for. The funeral home says that service is only available as part of a package. The package includes 8 other things the family does not want and did not ask about. The package costs $9,000. The individual service the family actually needs costs $400. And the funeral home refuses to sell the one thing without everything else. That practice is now permanently banned. Under the 2026 rule update, funeral homes are required to make every service available for individual purchase. A family that wants only direct cremation is entitled to receive direct cremation without purchasing anything else. A family that wants a graveside service and nothing else is entitled to buy exactly that. The Wall Street Journal conducted an independent investigation and identified over 500 funeral homes across the country engaged in documented deceptive practices. Bait and switch pricing, where families were quoted one number on the phone and handed a significantly higher bill after they had already committed emotionally. Hidden fees added after initial pricing conversations. In multiple documented cases, charging for services that were never performed at all. The industries that should be accountable to grieving families have spent 30 years operating in conditions that made accountability optional. That is what is changing. Here's what you need to do with this right now. If you ever walk into a funeral home and are told that a specific service is only available as part of a package, you now have the legal right to say no. You are entitled to purchase only what you want. If they refuse, that refusal is a violation of federal law, and you are entitled to leave and contact the FTC. The third permanent ban is the one I most want your family to understand, because it is the practice that was most effective at extracting money from people who were least able to protect themselves. Funeral homes are now permanently banned from telling families that any service is legally required unless they can cite the specific law by name and jurisdiction that requires it in the specific circumstances. The FTC investigators documented this happening repeatedly. Representatives telling callers that local health codes required embalming, that state law required a specific type of burial container, that regulations required a minimum level of preparation before viewing. None of those representations were true in the circumstances being described. All of them were designed to prevent a grieving family from asking further questions. Embalming alone generates hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue for the funeral industry. A significant portion of that revenue came from families who paid for it because they were told they had no choice. They had a choice. They just were not told about it. If a funeral home representative ever tells your family that a service is legally required, your response is now, what specific law requires this, and what is the exact jurisdiction? If they cannot answer that question with a specific citation, they cannot legally make that claim, and you are under no legal or ethical obligation to purchase what they are selling. Now let me show you something that most people do not see until they are forced to make a decision under the worst possible circumstances. The cost difference between your options. A traditional funeral with burial, including professional services, casket, embalming, preparation, chapel service, transportation, cemetery plot, opening and closing fees, and grave marker, costs between $8,000 and $12,000 nationally. In major metropolitan areas, New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, that number reaches $15,000 to $25,000 routinely. Direct cremation, where the body is cremated without a viewing, embalming, funeral home ceremony, or elaborate preparation, costs between $1,500 and $2,500. The family receives the cremated remains. They then choose when, where, and how to hold a memorial service entirely on their own terms, in a location that actually meant something to the person who died, on a timeline that works for the family, not for the funeral home's scheduling. Days or weeks after the loss, when the immediate shock has settled enough for people to actually be present for the gathering, rather than moving through it in a state of acute grief while the funeral home's clock is running. The price difference is not a quality difference. It is a structural difference in how the industry has historically been able to charge for services that families had no reference point to evaluate because prices were never visible until the family was already inside the building. You now have the legal right to see those prices before you are ever inside the building. There are two newer options also worth knowing about because many families are not aware they exist. Alkaline hydrolysis, sometimes called water cremation or aquamation, uses water, heat, and an alkaline solution to facilitate natural decomposition. No atmospheric emissions, significantly less energy than traditional cremation. The family receives remains that can be kept, scattered, or interred. As of 2026, this is now legal in the majority of United States states. The cost is generally comparable to traditional cremation. Natural organic reduction, sometimes called human composting, is now legal in Colorado, Washington, California, New York, Oregon, Vermont, and several additional states. The body transforms over several weeks into nutrient-rich soil through natural microbial activity. The soil can go to the family, to conservation land, or to an environmental organization. The cost in 2026 is generally between $3,000 and $7,000, substantially less than traditional burial, and for families with strong environmental values, an option that is now legally protected and increasingly available. These options exist. Most families are not told about them. Now you know. There is something I want to tell you about prepaid funeral arrangements specifically, because this is where seniors have historically been most vulnerable to a different kind of financial harm, and where the 2026 changes provide the most meaningful new protection. Pre-planning your funeral, selecting and in some cases prepaying for services in advance, has legitimate benefits. It removes the burden of decision-making from family members at the time of loss. It locks in current prices in an industry where costs have been rising steadily. And, done correctly, it ensures that the arrangements actually reflect what you wanted, rather than what surviving family members assumed you wanted. But, done incorrectly, prepayment of funeral expenses has resulted in significant financial loss. Families have lost prepaid funeral funds through funeral home bankruptcies, through ownership transfers where new management did not honor pre-arrangements, through situations where funds that were supposed to be held in trust were used for operating expenses instead. The 2026 rule updates include new requirements that address this directly. Prepaid funds must now be held in a state-regulated trust account or in an insurance product that carries the consumer's name as the beneficiary. The funeral home cannot use prepaid funds for operating expenses. The consumer has the right to a full accounting of where the funds are held, and in the event the funeral home closes or is sold, the prepaid arrangement is fully portable. The consumer can transfer to a different funeral home and receive full credit for what was already paid. These are meaningfully stronger protections than what existed before 2026. Here is something that very few people know and that could directly affect your financial planning if you are near Medicaid eligibility thresholds. Most states allow seniors to set aside funds for funeral and burial expenses in what is called an irrevocable prepaid funeral trust, and those funds are typically excluded from the asset calculations used to determine Medicaid eligibility. The specific amount varies by state, but in many states it is between $5,000 and $15,000 per person. What this means practically is that a senior who is planning for the possibility of needing Medicaid-funded long-term care can establish an irrevocable prepaid funeral trust, reduce their countable assets for Medicaid purposes, protect those funds from Medicaid estate recovery in most states, and ensure that resources exist to cover final expenses without becoming a financial burden on family members, all at the same time. This is not a planning strategy that comes up in most financial conversations about senior care. It is one the 2026 changes have made more accessible and more secure because of the stronger trust fund protections now required. If you are near Medicaid eligibility thresholds, ask your elder law attorney or financial advisor specifically about this. The question to ask is, what is the maximum irrevocable prepaid funeral trust amount excluded from Medicaid asset calculations in my state? That question, answered, could change the math on your planning in ways you may not have anticipated. There is also legislation actively moving through Congress in 2026 called the Funeral Coverage Act. If it passes, and it has meaningful bipartisan support in both chambers, Americans would be allowed to use health savings account funds to pay for funeral and final disposition expenses. Currently, HSA funds can only be used for qualified medical expenses. Funeral and burial costs are explicitly excluded. This means that people who have accumulated $20,000, $30,000, or $40,000 or more in their HSA accounts over years of contributions cannot currently use those funds for end-of-life planning expenses, even though doing so would be a rational use of savings that are otherwise restricted. The proposed change would allow HSA funds to be used for funeral home services, cremation, burial, and other final disposition expenses. As of 2026, this legislation has cleared Senate committee review. It has not passed yet, but if you have a meaningful HSA balance and are thinking about how to plan for final expenses without drawing down other savings, this is a development worth tracking and worth discussing with your financial advisor now, before it potentially becomes law. Here is every legal right you have right now that most people do not know they have. Any funeral home in the United States must give you a written general price list that is yours to keep without any obligation to purchase anything. You do not have to give your name, your address, your phone number, or any identifying information before they are required to answer your pricing questions. You have the right to purchase only the individual services you want. They cannot require you to buy a package as a condition of any individual service. They cannot tell you a service is legally required without being able to cite the specific law by name. They must disclose in writing any fees they add to third-party services they obtain on your behalf, including death certificates and cemetery charges. If you bring your own casket purchased elsewhere, they cannot charge you a handling fee for using it. That practice, charging a fee specifically because you did not buy the casket from them, is permanently banned under the 2026 updates. These rights exist today. They are federal rights. They apply to every funeral home in the country. And the reason most people do not know about them is that the funeral industry has had very little incentive to advertise them. Let me close with the practical steps your family needs to take, because knowing your rights is only useful if you can act on them when it matters. Before any loss occurs, go to the websites of 2 or 3 funeral homes in your area and look for their published general price lists. This is the first time in history you can do this without walking in and identifying yourself. The price differences you will find for identical services in the same market will likely surprise you. Research before you need to make a decision, not during. If you are doing any pre-planning, ask specifically how prepaid funds will be held, which trust institution or insurance product holds them, whether you will receive an annual accounting, and whether the arrangement is portable if the funeral home changes ownership. Under the 2026 rules, these questions have answers that the funeral home is required to provide. If you are near Medicaid eligibility thresholds, have the irrevocable prepaid funeral trust conversation with your attorney or advisor. Ask specifically about the excluded asset amount in your state, and if you have a meaningful HSA balance, track the Funeral Coverage Act. It has not passed yet, but the trajectory is meaningful. If you or your family ever walk into a situation where a funeral home tells you something is legally required, a specific service, a specific type of container, a specific preparation, ask for the law by name and jurisdiction. If they cannot provide it, you are not legally or ethically required to purchase what they are selling. The Federal Trade Commission spent years building the evidentiary record that produced the 2026 permanent bans, undercover investigations, documented violations, hundreds of pages of enforcement history. What they found was an industry that had historically profited from the gap between what grieving families were told and what the law actually required. The 2026 changes close that gap. They do not eliminate every risk. They do not guarantee that every interaction with every provider will be honest and fair. What they do is give your family information and legal tools they did not have before. The family that walks in knowing their rights is a fundamentally different consumer than the family that walks in knowing only what the funeral home chooses to tell them. Share this with your family. Put it in front of the person in your family who handles planning. Because the 30 minutes it takes to understand this, calmly, before any loss has occurred, is the 30 minutes that protects your family from making a $9,000 decision they did not have to make. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because when the Funeral Coverage Act moves forward, and when enforcement actions under the new permanent bans begin making news, I will cover it here, in plain language, before it affects you. Drop a comment and tell me which of the 3 permanent bans surprised you most. I read every comment, and I want to know what people are learning for the first time from this video. I will see you in the next one.